You know, the universe is made of stories, not of atoms, said the poet Muriel Rukeyser. And I know this to be true because all of us are hardwired to recognize a great story well told. Children instinctively know to laugh when something is funny. And all of us love the truth when we see or hear it. We go, yes, that's the way life is. And my fondest memories are the long summers I spent with my grandparents when I was growing up, and on both sides, they lived in Kentucky. My father's side of the family had a Revolutionary War land grant farm and went back 11 generations. And D.W. Griffith, the father of cinema, also was born and grew up in the town near my great-grandfather. On my mother's side, they all came from the area where Abraham Lincoln was born in a log cabin, who was the great storytelling president. And of course, there's Cassius Clay, who came from Louisville, Kentucky, who reinvented his story and renamed himself Muhammad Ali, and now his story transcends all the ages. So what is it about a region that fosters such excellence? You think about Nashville, there in Tennessee, it flourishes with great music. You think about Great Britain, for 500 years since the time of Shakespeare, Great Britain has given us world-class drama and phenomenal actors. And then in America, at every playground, you see a basketball hoop. And you see young boys to men playing pickup games of basketball, vying, competing. But what you're also seeing in these environments, whether it's music, sports, or in my case, storytelling, is people coming together and creating community. They love what they're doing. And in my case, I always experienced with my grandparents the joy of receiving their neighbors. And you also had within that environment a sense of mentoring and mastery. And so they called my grandparents the Front Porch Society, that whole era, where everybody had a swing on the front porch, and if a neighbor dropped by, a friend, family, everything stopped. A piece of pie was presented, a cup of coffee, and the stories began. And they always began with something silly or funny. You know, they said, I'll tell something on myself. But then it quickly segued into thoughtful stories, even profound, that everyone in the community could weigh in on and share, you know, experiences during a great flood or the war, or when a World War II hero flew home but crashed in the field nearby. And at the same time as Harper Lee, in her great American masterpiece, To Kill a Mockingbird, portrayed my grandparents' era. And in the character Gregory Peck played of Atticus Finch, he says to Scout on the front porch swing, you never really understand a person until you consider things from his point of view, until you climb into his skin and walk around in it. And that's what I experienced in this world. People taking the time to hear each other's points of view, finding a way to come together and find common ground. Well, you know, I thought that everybody grew up like that, you know, so I took it for granted. And it wasn't until the 1980s when the U.S. Library of Congress issued a call for grants to be created to collect the oral history of my grandparents' generation. They called them the last great storytellers who possessed a unique American folk art. They actually called them a national treasure. And it was about to be lost to the ages. And that's why they wanted us to do audio tape recordings. Well, I had no idea. I knew I'd lost my two grandfathers already, so time was of the essence. So I applied for some grants, and I took off. And it wasn't so much that I was going to collect the stories of my elders and their friends, but I was going to collect the stories of a whole region of elders. And what I found on this journey, which ended up taking 18 months, and ultimately I went all over the United States because many of these elders had moved on, was two things. One, there was a journey I never thought I could experience, and that was the experience of living memory. Because these elders had their elders who had been born in the 1800s. And I will never forget one person saying to me that his grandfather had been a Yankee, but his brother had been a Confederate. And her grandfather saw his own brother shot in the back and killed. And suddenly, living history came before my eyes. I could feel it. I could feel the heart-rending drama of a family torn apart. And also, I could feel the schism that tore apart the United States of America. I learned an even more important thing from these elders. Now, I wasn't interested in hearing grandfathers sitting in a rocking chair, telling a tall tale. That wasn't it at all. What I was interested in is how they talked about their choices in their times. And remember, we all live in interesting times. But to a person, they all said to me, my story's not so interesting. Everybody went through it. If you think about it, why do men never want to talk about their experiences at war? They always say to a person, everybody went through it. My experience was nothing exceptional. But what I could feel was that they had a need to tell their story, and also there was a story behind the story. And so this led me to a very important facet of my work, which was learning the radical act of listening. It was Maya Angelou who said, "There is no greater agony than bearing an untold story inside you." And she would know. She grew up in the Jim Crow South. She ended up telling her story in her masterful memoir, I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings. But it wasn't until I went to the actual Library of Congress, the building itself in Washington, D.C., and I saw this flag. It's huge. They have it on display. It says, "A man was lynched yesterday." And it was a flag that the NAACP hung out their windows over Fifth Avenue in New York City every time an African-American man was lynched in the Deep South. Sometimes that was once a week, sometimes more often for over 20 years, although this had been going on for 150 years. And why did they do it? It was because it was an untold story by the press. Everyone said, well, it makes us uncomfortable. Yeah, we all know about it. Sorry. And even the owner of the building said to the NAACP, we want you to take the flag in. It's upsetting everyone. But now, we have a whole new era. And each of us possesses the power to tell the story. And with smartphones and viral media, we now have the Black Lives Matter movement, which is a direct descendant of the lynching movement. And now, just by the sheer volume of the stories, the ubiquitous, across the nation, the similarity of the stories of African-American men being profiled, harassed, shot, and even killed by the police, or people thinking they're the police, all of that has now come out. So it can no longer be an untold story. In fact, silence is betrayal now. Similarly, here in Boston, in 2002, in January, we have a whole new form of creating a voice for truth, and that is data. The Boston Globe Spotlight investigation team came out with a systematic analysis of decades-long a conscious relocation by the Catholic Church, parish priests whom they knew were pedophiles. And they had been relocated from parish to parish with the consent of the church. The day this story came out, they said the phone started ringing and never stopped. It was the first viral internet story that reached all over the world and now has created a revolution in the Catholic Church all the way up to the Vatican and Pope Francis today. And then we had, in October 2017, it was always the issue with sexual harassment issues, especially in the workplace, that it was his word against her word. How could we know? He said, she said. And yet, it wasn't until 3 reporters, Jodi Kantor and Megan Twohey from the New York Times, Ronan Farrow from the New Yorker magazine, they all came out with stories that showed the sheer volume and consistency of stories by women who had been preyed upon by men in power in Hollywood and in the entertainment industry. It was undeniable by the sheer volume and consistency of their stories. And so, of course, it led to a tsunami reaction by women who now knew that their stories, in totality, created a whole new voice for a movement, the Me2 movement. You know, it was Ronan Farrell who said his mandate going in was never to believe all the survivors, it was to listen to all the survivors. It was to create a space for survivors to be heard. And this has actually been my life's work. I'm often asked by people, you know, can you teach me how to tell a story? And so what I do is I'll create a workshop, and I keep it rather small, about 12 people. And I always start with a story question that everyone will have to answer. Typically, it's a question like this. Tell us a story about yourself that we would otherwise never know. And I know the first two stories will always be inconsequential, unremarkable. Oh, they'll be funny and it'll break the ice, and because nobody wants to reveal themselves. But the third story is always profound. And I'll never forget the story of a man whom I shall call Tom. He was very fit, very trim. He was in his late 40s. And he said, you know, when I was 14 years old, I left home. And thereafter, for years, he said, I held down a series of odd jobs. And my only goal was to make enough money every week so that I could go out and go partying and get blinding drunk. And he did this for years. Until one day, he woke up in a plastic diner booth to blinding sunlight, and all he could hear was the drone of a floor buffer on the linoleum around his feet, and he could smell the sickly sweet smell of cleaning going on around him. And he couldn't remember where he was or what he had been doing for the previous 4 days. And so he left the building, he went out on the street, and at that time there were phone booths on every corner, and he went into a phone booth where hanging were the yellow pages. And he rifled through the pages until he found the local number for Alcoholics Anonymous. And he called them and he said, can you help me? And they took down his name and his address, and they said, go home, and we'll send someone to pick you up and take you to a meeting tonight. And I said, and then what did you do? He said, well, I went home. And as soon as I got there, he said, I found every bottle of wine, every half-drunk bottle of alcohol stashed in the corner of the couch or under the sink or in the cupboards. And he said, I flushed it all down the toilet. And then, I asked. He said, and then I sat down by the radiator and waited and watched the sun set that day. Finally, there was a knock on the door, and it was the man Hay had promised would be there. And he went with him to his first meeting. And Tom never had another drink after that night. He was 29 years old. And I said, Tom, why on that day of all days did you make that choice? I mean, you'd been drinking for over half your life. And he said, you know, I don't know. And I also don't know why I told you this story. I've never told it to anyone. Everybody in the room was gutted. They worked for Tom. They didn't know this was his history. But I knew why Tom had told the story. Two forces had aligned. One, he needed to tell the story. And two, I had created a space for him to be heard. And I continued quietly nudging him, reassuring him that we were listening. And what were we listening to? It wasn't just a series of, choices. Oh, he woke up, he made a phone call, he flushed the wine down the toilet, he sat down. Those are all ordinary choices maybe many of us have made in our own lives. What we were listening to was the extraordinary choice of a man waking up to discover the courage to win his life. None of us have enough imagination or courage to live our own lives. That's why we need stories. So in fact, world-class athletes, and for the purposes of this story, I'm picking two. Jordan Spieth from the world of golf, and Michael Phelps from the world of Olympic gold medal swimming. And they say, as do all athletes at this caliber, that not only do they practice their sport every day, they also practice exercising their imaginations, and they see in their mind's eye every nanosecond of what it takes to win their goal. They call this creating muscle memory. So what we are doing when we listen to someone's story, we are also expanding our imaginations, and we are developing a spiritual muscle memory so that we can see ourselves winning our own lives. You know, Tom's story, it only took less than 5 minutes really to tell it. But we were doing all the listening. And in both sides, we were changed. He gave us a sense of wonder, our hearts expanded, our imaginations soared. You know, it was J.K. Rowling who said, "No story lives unless someone wants to listen." And what you're doing in the process is creating a living memory that you keep in your heart. And you can trade on that for years to come as you face your own life choices. But what happens if you decide, you're not interested in a subject, don't want to listen anymore, it's not my thing? Well, a year ago, on April 12th, Holocaust Remembrance Day, I saw this story on the front page of the New York Times. The Holocaust apparently is fading from contemporary memory, this survey has found. That over 41% of American adults and 61% of millennials do not know what the word Auschwitz means. Over 1/3 do not even know how many people perished in the Holocaust. And you think, how can this be? We've had 7 generations, 7 decades of the Jewish community saying, never forget. We've had countless documentaries, award-winning, Oscar-winning films. How can it fade so quickly? But I will tell you, this is a case where living memory is the only way you keep your conscious alive. It takes one generation saying to the other, yes, this memory is a horror. It reveals the worst of humanity. But when people hear it, they will discover the courage within themselves and be emboldened and strengthened to say never again. But if we don't, we will consign ourselves to ignorance, and history will repeat itself, such that white nationalists will march on Thomas Jefferson's campus in Virginia. So when we come together and create a common space, face to face, to share our stories, 2 things happen. You and I develop a courage we never knew possible, and a wonder because we have climbed into someone else's skin and walked around in it. But the person who's telling the story has the experience of being heard, which is so close to being loved as to be almost indistinguishable. This is the way our democracy has flourished, and this is the way we can keep changing our world for the better. Thank you for listening.